Sometimes the greatest discoveries come when everyone thinks you've made the biggest mistake of your life. That's exactly what happened when wealthy trader Bjarke Runolfsson bought an ancient ruined temple that everyone said was worthless. The council mocked him for wasting 3 chests of silver on moss-covered stones. They said he'd bought nothing but ruins and snake pits. But Bjarke had been having strange dreams about voices calling his name from beneath those ancient stones. When he walked through the crumbling halls, he found something hidden deep inside. Behind walls of black stone and iron, he discovered a secret chamber with carvings that revealed an impossible truth about his own bloodline. But what exactly had he awakened in those depths? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants, and Bjarke Runolfsson stood at the edge of his property, watching the sun paint the water gold. At 53, he had learned that wealth could buy many things, but it could not purchase the respect of men who had known you when you were nothing. More than a fisherman's son, with calloused hands and patched clothes, the silver pendant at his throat, his grandmother's last gift, caught the early light as he turned toward the great hall, where the council would soon gather. Today they would hear his proposal, and today they would likely think him mad. Bjarke's trading empire stretched across 3 kingdoms now. His ships carried furs from the frozen north, amber from the Baltic shores, and spices from lands so distant their names sounded like whispered prayers. The council respected his coin, certainly, but they had never forgotten the boy who once cleaned fish guts from their doorsteps for a copper piece, Master Bjarke. His steward, Olaf the Grey, approached with the measured steps of a man who had served warriors and merchants alike. "The council summons you," Bjarke nodded, his fingers unconsciously touching the pendant again. For 3 months now, the dreams had come with increasing intensity. Always the same voice, always calling his name from somewhere deep beneath stone and earth. His grandmother had told him stories of such callings when he was young, tales of bloodlines that stretched back to the time before the gods walked openly among men. He had dismissed them as the ramblings of an old woman whose mind wandered between worlds. Now, he wondered if she had been trying to prepare him for something. The great hall of Nordhelm buzzed with the low murmur of conversation as Bjarke entered. 12 men sat around the circular table carved from a single oak that had supposedly stood when the first settlers arrived. Each bore the weathered marks of leadership, scars from battles fought, lines etched by difficult decisions, and eyes that had seen enough of the world to trust little and believe less. Jarl Eriksson, a mountain of a man whose beard had gone white in service to his people, struck the table with his hammer. "Bjarke Runolfsson seeks our counsel on a matter of land purchase. Speak your peace, trader." The dismissive tone in trader was not lost on anyone present. Bjarke rose slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. He had learned long ago that rushing to defend yourself only made you appear guilty of something. "Honored council," he began, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of negotiating with kings and merchants alike. "I come before you to declare my intention to purchase the ruins of Eidravoller." The silence that followed was so complete that Bjarke could hear the flames crackling in the great hearth. Then, like a dam bursting, the laughter began. "Eidravoller?" Jarl Eriksson's voice boomed across the hall. "The old temple." "Bjarke, my friend, have your travels addled your wits? That place has been nothing but broken stones and brambles for longer than most of us have drawn breath." Councilman Sigurd, a thin man whose shrewd mind had made him wealthy through careful investments, leaned forward. "The land is cursed, Bjarke. You know the stories. 3 families have tried to clear those ruins over the years. One lost their crops to blight, another had their livestock sicken and die, and the third simply abandoned their efforts after their eldest son claimed he heard voices in the night." Voices," Bjarke repeated softly, and several council members shifted uncomfortably. "Old women's tales, declared Ragnar Ironhand, though his voice lacked conviction. But even setting aside superstition, what possible use could you have for such a place? The land is poor for farming, too far from the harbour for trade, and the ruins themselves are nothing but a hazard. Bjarke had anticipated these objections. Indeed, he had made many of them himself when the dreams first began. But as the visions grew stronger, as the voice calling his name became clearer, he had come to understand that some things could not be explained through logic alone. The previous owner, Widow Astrid, has agreed to sell for 3 chests of silver, Bjarke announced. I ask only that the council witness the transaction and record the transfer according to our laws. The sum drew sharp intakes of breath around the table. 3 chests of silver could buy a fleet of trading vessels or enough livestock to feed a village through 3 harsh winters. 3 chests? Jarl Ericsson's eyes narrowed. For ruins that aren't worth 3 copper coins? Bjarke, I have known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, and I have watched you build an empire through shrewd dealings and careful planning. This is neither shrewd nor careful. This is the action of a man who has lost his sense. Old Magnus, the council's eldest member, spoke for the first time. His voice was a whisper of wind through dry leaves, but every man leaned forward to hear him. Perhaps, he said slowly, the question is not why Bjarke would pay such a price, but why he feels compelled to do so. The words hung in the air like smoke from a sacrificial fire. Magnus had lived through more summers than any of them, had seen things that belonged to stories told around winter hearths. If anyone would understand the pull of forces beyond the material world, it would be him. The dreams began 3 months ago, Bjarke said quietly, addressing Magnus directly. Always the same. Her voice calling my name from beneath ancient stone. I thought it was merely the product of too much rich food and wine before sleep. But they have grown stronger, more vivid. I can almost feel the weight of the earth above me, smell the dust of ages, hear the echo of my footsteps in chambers that have known no light for generations. The hall had grown silent again, but this was a different silence, heavier, more thoughtful. My grandmother used to tell stories, Bjarke continued, his hand finding the silver pendant at his throat. Stories of bloodlines that carried obligations across the ages, of calls that could not be ignored, of destinies written in stone and starlight. I dismissed them as an old woman's fantasies. He met each council member's gaze in turn. But what if they were not fantasies? What if some truths are too large for our understanding, too ancient for our modern sensibilities? Councilman Sigurd cleared his throat. You speak of dreams and bloodlines, Bjarke. But you ask us to witness the transfer of a fortune based on what might be nothing more than troubled sleep. I ask you to witness a transaction between consenting parties, Bjarke replied evenly. Nothing more, nothing less. What I do with my property after the purchase is my concern alone. Jarl Eriksson drummed his fingers on the ancient oak table. And if you find nothing but broken stones and snake pits, if these dreams prove to be mere phantoms of an overburdened mind. Bjarke smiled, and for a moment the merchant facade fell away, revealing something deeper, a man who had made peace with uncertainty, who had learned to trust in forces beyond his comprehension. Then I will have purchased the most expensive lesson in humility that any man has ever received. But I have lived long enough to know that some risks are worth taking, regardless of their outcome. Some calls must be answered, even if we cannot understand their source. The pendant at his throat seemed to grow warm against his skin, and for just an instant, Bjarke could have sworn he heard that distant voice again, calling his name across the centuries. Magnus nodded slowly, as if Bjarke's words had confirmed something the old man had long suspected. There are more things in this world than our fathers taught us, he said. More paths to wisdom than gold and conquest can provide. The vote, when it came, was closer than Bjarke had expected. 7 in favor of witnessing the transaction, 5 against. Jarl Eriksson, though he had voted in favor, wore the expression of a man who feared he might be enabling a friend's destruction. So be it, the Jarl declared. Let the record show that Bjarke Runolfsson, merchant of Nordhelm, has purchased the ruins of Idravola from Widow Astrid for the sum of 3 chests of silver, witnessed this day by the council in lawful assembly. As the formal proceedings concluded and the council members filed out, many casting worried glances in Bjarke's direction, Magnus approached with the careful steps of advanced age. "Your grandmother," the old man said quietly. "What was her name?" "Solveig," Bjarke replied. "Solveig Runekeeper, though I never understood why they called her that." Magnus's eyes widened slightly. "Solveig Runekeeper died when I was but a young man, but I remember the stories. They said she could read the ancient markings, that she knew the old ways before the coming of the Christ God. They said her bloodline stretched back to the first settlers, to those who built the great temples." He paused, studying Bjarke's face with the intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle written in a forgotten language. "They also said," Magnus continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "that her line carried a burden, a calling that would come in the fullness of time. When the old places stirred and the forgotten sought to be remembered, Bjarke felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air." "What kind of calling?" But Magnus was already walking away, his words floating back like an echo from the past. "Some knowledge is not given freely, young Runolfsson. Some truths must be earned through trial and discovery. But remember this, when you walk those ancient halls, you walk not alone, but in the footsteps of those who came before." 3 days later, Bjarke stood at the edge of the ruins of Idravola for the first time as their owner. The autumn mist swirled around broken pillars and fallen stones, creating shapes that seemed almost human in the half-light. Moss and ivy had claimed much of the ancient stonework, but beneath the green shroud, he could see the precision of the original construction. Massive blocks fitted together so perfectly that not even a blade could slip between them. The pendant at his throat grew warm again, and somewhere in the distance, or perhaps in his mind, he heard the voice calling his name. Stronger now, more urgent. Tomorrow he would enter the ruins properly. Tonight he would prepare himself for whatever truths lay waiting in the depths of forgotten time. The first light of dawn was still hours away when Bjarke woke to the sound of his name being called. Not the distant whisper from his dreams, but something closer, more immediate. He sat up in his bed, heart hammering against his ribs, listening to the silence that followed. The trading hall around him was still, filled only with the familiar creaks and sighs of settling timber. But the voice had been real. He was certain of it. Rising quietly so as not to wake his household, Bjarke dressed in simple wool and leather, the kind of clothing he had worn in his youth when comfort mattered more than appearance. The silver pendant settled against his chest, and he noticed it felt warmer than usual, as if it had been resting near a fire. The ruins of Idravola lay only an hour's walk from his hall, but in the pre-dawn darkness, the journey felt like a pilgrimage to the edge of the world. Bjarke carried a torch and a leather satchel containing rope, an iron pry bar, and the small eating knife that had been his companion for 30 years. He had no clear plan beyond answering the call that had grown too strong to ignore. As he crested the final hill, the ruins emerged from the mist like the bones of some ancient giant. The temple had been built in the old style, with massive stone blocks and soaring arches that spoke of a time when men built for eternity rather than convenience. Time and weather had taken their toll. The roof had long since collapsed, leaving only the outer walls and several interior chambers partially intact. But it was the entrance that drew Bjarke's attention. The great wooden doors that had sealed the temple for generations hung askew, one hanging by a single iron hinge, the other lying in fragments among the weeds. Fresh gouges marked the stone frame, as if something had clawed its way out from within, or clawed its way in. Bjarke approached cautiously, his torch held high. The wood was ancient oak, thick as a man's torso and reinforced with iron bands. Whatever had broken these doors possessed strength far beyond human capability. As he examined the damage more closely, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The claw marks were not random. They formed patterns, symbols that seemed almost familiar. As if he had seen them before in half-remembered dreams, the pendant at his throat grew warmer still, and now he could feel it pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. Bjarke. The voice came from within the ruins, clear and unmistakable, not the whispered calling of his dreams, but the sound of someone speaking his name with urgent need. He stepped through the broken doorway. The interior of the temple was a maze of fallen stones and creeping vines, but his torch revealed traces of the original grandeur. Carved pillars rose toward the missing roof, their surfaces covered with intricate knotwork and runic inscriptions. Broken statues lay scattered among the debris, warriors and gods whose faces had been worn smooth by time. Their identities lost to all but the most ancient memories, the voice called again. Deeper within the structure, and Bjarke followed it through passages that seemed to grow narrower with each step. His torch cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating the illusion of movement in the carved figures that watched his progress with blind stone eyes. At the heart of the temple, he found what had once been the main chamber. The floor was a mosaic of colored stones, depicting scenes he could not quite decipher. Figures in flowing robes standing before what appeared to be a great tree, its roots extending deep into the earth, its branches reaching towards star-filled skies. Much of the image was obscured by rubble and vegetation, but enough remained to suggest a story of profound significance. "Here," the voice said, and Bjarke realized it was coming from beneath his feet. He knelt among the broken stones, pushing aside debris and pulling away the tough vines that had grown through cracks in the mosaic. His fingers found the edge of something smooth and cold, a section of the floor that was different from the rest, made not of fitted stones, but of a single piece of black material that seemed to absorb the light of his torch. As he cleared more of the area, a shape emerged, a circle perhaps 6 feet across, set flush with the surrounding floor, but clearly separate from it. Around the circumference, carved in lines so fine they might have been made by the gods themselves, ran symbols that made the pendant at his throat burn with sudden heat. Bjarke gasped and pulled back, his hand instinctively going to the silver pendant. As his fingers touched the warm metal, the symbols around the circle began to glow with a soft blue light. Pulsing in the same rhythm as the pendant's heat, the voice spoke again, but now it seemed to come from all around him, echoing off the broken walls and filling the space with words in a language he had never learned but somehow understood. "Blood of the line. Keeper of the keys, the time of awakening has come. What sleeps below stirs at your approach. What was sealed must be opened. What was forgotten must be remembered." The circular section of floor began to move, rotating slowly with a grinding sound like millstones turning. Ancient mechanisms, dormant for centuries, awakened at the touch of his bloodline. The black material slid aside to reveal a spiral staircase carved from the living rock. Descending into depths that his torchlight could not penetrate, cool air rose from the opening, carrying scents of mineral and metal, of spaces that had known no human breath for generations, uncounted. But beneath those familiar underground odors lay something else, something that spoke of power and purpose, of secrets waiting to be claimed by one who carried the right to claim them. As Bjarke stared into the darkness below, the pendant at his throat pulsed once more with brilliant heat, and suddenly his mind was filled with images that were not his own. He saw the temple as it had been in its glory, not merely a place of worship, but a gateway, a threshold between the world of men and something far more ancient. He saw robed figures performing rituals around this very opening, speaking words that shaped reality itself, and he saw his grandmother as a young woman, standing in this same spot, her hand on the same pendant he now wore, her voice joining with others in a chant that had kept the old powers sleeping for 50 years. "The guardianship passes to you now," the voice said, and this time he recognized it, his grandmother's voice, but stronger than it had been in her final years, filled with the authority she had carried in her youth. "What I sealed, you must now open. What I held back, you must now release. The blood remembers, even when the mind forgets. Bjarke's hand trembled as he raised the torch higher, trying to peer deeper into the stairwell. How far did it descend? What lay at its bottom? And why had his grandmother never told him of this burden while she lived? Because, her voice answered his unspoken question, some knowledge cannot be given. It must be earned through choice and courage. You could have ignored the dreams, dismissed the calling, lived out your days in comfortable ignorance. But you are here, Bjarke Runolfsson. You have chosen to answer, and in choosing you have claimed your inheritance. The pendant's heat was almost unbearable now, but Bjarke found he could not remove it. It had become part of him, a link to powers and purposes that stretched back through generations of his bloodline to the first builders of this place. As he took his first step onto the spiral staircase, the carved symbols around the opening flared brighter, and he heard the sound of stone moving far below. Whatever waited in the depths was awakening, responding to his presence, preparing for his arrival. The familiar world above, his trading empire, his comfortable hall, his place among the merchants and councilmen of Nordhelm, suddenly seemed like a half-remembered dream. This was his reality now. Ancient stairs descending into mystery, a heritage written in stone and starlight, and a destiny that had been waiting 50 years for him to claim it. Behind him, the first rays of dawn painted the ruins gold, but Bjarke was already walking into darkness, following the call of his blood toward whatever truth lay sleeping in the depths of the earth. The spiral staircase descended for what felt like hours. Though Bjarke knew his sense of time had become unreliable in this place where ancient powers stirred. Each step downward brought new sounds, distant echoes that might have been dripping water or something far more unsettling, and a low humming that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. His torch burned steadily, but the flame had taken on an odd quality, casting light that revealed more than it should. Details in the carved walls stood out with supernatural clarity, showing him images that told the story of this place across the ages. He saw the original builders, tall figures with elongated features who moved with grace that spoke of more than human heritage. He watched them seal something beneath the earth, their faces grave with the weight of their decision. The pendant against his chest had grown so warm it was nearly painful. But with each step deeper, Bjarke felt a strange sense of coming home. This was where he belonged, where his bloodline had always been meant to return. The staircase finally opened into a vast chamber carved from the living rock. Bjarke's torch flame leapt higher as it encountered the larger space, illuminating walls covered in metallic veins that caught and reflected the light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The ceiling arched high above, supported by pillars that had not been built but grown, twisted spires of black stone that pulsed with their own inner light. At the center of the chamber stood a structure that defied easy description. It might have been an altar or a throne, or something that served purposes for which human language had no words. The stone from which it was carved was neither black nor white, but seemed to shift between colors that existed at the edges of vision. Upon its surface, symbols writhed and changed even as Bjarke watched, telling stories in a script that his eyes could not read, but his blood understood. And lying upon this impossible altar, gleaming despite the centuries, was a sword. Not merely a weapon, Bjarke realized as he approached, but a blade forged for purposes that transcended warfare. The steel, if it was steel, held patterns within its depths like captured lightning, and the crossguard was wrought in the shape of a tree whose roots and branches extended along the fuller. The pommel bore the same symbol that adorned his grandmother's pendant, but here it was not merely carved decoration. It pulsed with the same rhythm as his heartbeat. The blade of awakening, his grandmother's voice whispered in his mind, forged in the fires between worlds, tempered in the tears of gods. Whoever draws it from its rest takes upon themselves the burden of keeping the ancient compact. Bjarke circled the altar slowly, studying the weapon from every angle. He had seen many fine blades in his travels, Damascus steel from the south, pattern-welded iron from the masters of the Rhine, ceremonial swords worked with gold and gems for princes who had never known battle. This was something else entirely, a tool crafted for purposes that went far beyond the cutting of flesh. As he drew closer, the symbols on the blade's surface began to glow more brightly, and he could feel power radiating from the metal like heat from forge fire. This was no mere sword, but a key, a focus for forces that had slept beneath the earth for generations. His hand moved toward the hilt, almost without conscious thought, drawn by the pull of destiny and bloodline. But as his fingers neared the grip, the chamber filled with a sound like breaking glass. And suddenly, he was not alone. Shapes moved in the shadows between the pillars. Not quite human, not quite beast, but something that partook of both natures. They flowed rather than walked, their forms shifting between solid flesh and wisps of darkness that smelled of old graves and forgotten sorrows. The guardian spirits, his grandmother's voice warned. They have kept watch while the blade slept, ensuring that only one of the true bloodline could claim it. But the centuries have changed them, corrupted their purpose. They remember their duty, but not its meaning. The spirits circled closer, and Bjarke could see details that made his skin crawl. They had once been men, he realized, guardians placed here when the blade was first sealed away. But the long years of watching over powers beyond human comprehension had transformed them into something between life and death, purpose and madness. One of them spoke, its voice like wind through broken reeds. Who disturbs the eternal vigil? Who dares approach the sacred trust? Bjarke straightened, drawing upon all the authority he had learned in decades of difficult negotiations. I am Bjarke Runolfsson, grandson of Solveig Runekeeper, and I come to claim what is mine by right of blood. The spirits paused in their circling, and he could feel their attention focus upon him like the weight of a mountain. The pendant at his throat blazed with sudden heat, and its light caused the guardians to recoil, with hisses of what might have been pain or recognition. The blood remembers, one of them whispered. But does the soul understand? Does the mind accept the burden that comes with the claiming? Tell me, Bjarke said, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. Tell me what I must know. The lead spirit drifted closer, and Bjarke could see that its face had once been human. Noble features worn away by time and duty until only the shadow of mortality remained. When it spoke, its words carried the weight of prophecy and doom. The blade was forged to keep the balance, to stand between the world of men and the powers that would devour it. For 1,000 years, your bloodline has held this trust, sealing away what must not wake, guarding what must not be claimed by those who would use it for conquest rather than protection. The spirit gestured toward the sword, and its form grew more solid, more defined. But seals weaken with time, and the hungry dark grows stronger. The blade must wake now, or all will be lost to the rising shadow. Yet know this, whoever takes up this burden cannot lay it down. Whoever draws this steel from its rest becomes bound to it until death claims them, or the world ends. Bjarke stared at the weapon, understanding now why his grandmother had never spoken of this directly. The choice before him was not merely whether to claim an inheritance, but whether to accept a responsibility that would reshape his entire existence. His comfortable life as a merchant, his plans for a peaceful old age, his dreams of leaving behind an empire built on trade and gold, all of it would become secondary to this larger purpose. What happens if I refuse? He asked. The spirits exchanged glances, and their forms seemed to grow dimmer. Then the compact breaks, and what sleeps below wakes to feed. The northern lands fall first, consumed by hunger that has grown for a millennium. Then the darkness spreads, until all the world becomes a feeding ground for things that should never have been. The chamber fell silent, except for the low humming of the stone and the sound of Bjarke's own breathing. He thought of the council back in Nordhelm, of Jarl Eriksson's laughter when he had announced his intention to buy these ruins. They had thought him a fool for spending 3 chests of silver on worthless stones. If only they knew what he was truly purchasing. His hand moved toward the sword hilt once more, and this time he did not hesitate. The moment Bjarke's fingers closed around the sword's hilt, The world exploded into light and sound and sensation beyond human endurance. Every nerve in his body screamed as power beyond mortal comprehension flowed through him, rewriting his very essence at the deepest level. He felt his consciousness expand beyond the confines of his skull, stretching across vast distances and impossible dimensions for an instant that lasted eternity. He was everything and nothing, a grain of sand on an infinite shore, a star burning in the darkness between worlds. He felt the weight of every choice his bloodline had ever made, saw the faces of ancestors stretching back through generations to the first builders of this place. Each had carried this burden in their time. Each had stood where he now stood and made the choice that bound them to powers beyond understanding. Then the vision narrowed, focused, and he was himself again, but changed, fundamentally and irreversibly. The blade in his hand no longer felt like metal, but like an extension of his own will, warm and alive, and singing with contained purpose. The guardian spirits around him had fallen to their knees, their forms growing more solid and human, as the sword's awakening restored something of their original nature. "It is done," the lead spirit said, and his voice now carried tones of relief mixed with ancient sorrow. "The compact is renewed, the watch restored. We who have guarded so long may finally rest." The spirits began to fade, not with the dissolution of destruction, but with the peaceful departure of duty fulfilled. As they vanished, each one touched his forehead in a gesture of blessing or farewell, leaving behind whispers of gratitude that echoed in the vast chamber. When the last guardian had departed, Bjarke found himself alone with the runic chronicle, a massive tome bound in scales that might have come from no earthly creature, its pages covered with symbols that rearranged themselves even as he watched. It lay upon a lectern of carved bone beside the altar, and somehow he knew it had appeared the moment he claimed the blade. The chronicle contained the history of his bloodline's compact, written in a script that his transformed consciousness could now read as easily as his native tongue. Page after page detailed the responsibilities of the blade-bearer, the signs to watch for, the rituals needed to maintain the seals that kept the hungry darkness at bay. As he read, Bjarke began to understand the true scope of what he had inherited. The temple above was merely the visible tip of a vast network of barriers and bindings that stretched across the northern lands. Sacred groves where standing stones hummed with protective power. Hidden caves where ancient wards kept sleeping horrors from stirring. Mountain peaks where signal fires had once been lit to warn of approaching darkness. All of it had been maintained by his bloodline for 1,000 years, and all of it now fell to him. The Chronicle also revealed why the calling had come now after 50 years of slumber. The seals were weakening, not through age alone, but through active assault. Something had been testing the boundaries, probing for weak points, seeking a way to break free from its prison beneath the earth. The guardian spirit's corruption had been only the first sign, a canary in the coal mine of cosmic horror. Bjarke closed the Chronicle with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of knowledge. His old life, the merchant's concerns with profit and reputation, seemed like a child's game played with wooden toys. He had responsibilities now that dwarfed any earthly concern. But first, he had to return to the surface and face the questions that would inevitably come. The climb back up the spiral staircase felt different now. The blade at his side, for he found he could not bear to sheath it, as if it needed to breathe the same air he did, cast its own light, revealing details in the carved walls that his torch had missed. He saw now that the entire stairway was itself a ward, every symbol precisely placed to channel and contain the energies that flowed through this place. When he emerged into the main chamber of the temple, dawn had given way to full morning. Sunlight streamed through the broken roof, and he could hear voices approaching from outside, familiar voices that made his heart sink with the complexity of what was to come. "Bjarke!" Jarl Ericsson's voice boomed across the ruins. "Where are you, man? Your steward said you left before dawn, and when we saw the doors of this cursed place broken open, the Jarl's words trailed off as Bjarke stepped into view, the awakened blade gleaming in his hand like captured starlight. Behind Eriksson came half the council, their faces showing expressions that ranged from concern to outright fear as they took in the sight of him. He looked different, Bjarke realized. The transformation that had taken place below must be visible somehow, marking him as something other than the merchant they had known. The Chronicle had warned of this, that claiming the blade would set him apart from ordinary humanity, making him a bridge between worlds, but fully belonging to neither. "What have you done?" Councilman Sigurd whispered, his shrewd merchant's mind struggling to process what his eyes were showing him. "What have you found in this accursed place?" Bjarke considered his words carefully. How did one explain cosmic responsibility to men whose greatest concerns involved trading routes and cattle disputes? How could he make them understand that the comfortable world they knew existed only because his bloodline had stood guard against forces that would devour it without hesitation? "I have found my inheritance," he said finally, "and with it a duty that my family has carried for generations." Old Magnus stepped forward, his ancient eyes fixed not on the blade, but on Bjarke's face. "You look older," he observed. "Not in body, but in spirit. You carry weight now that was not there yesterday." "Some weights cannot be set down once lifted," Bjarke replied. The blade pulsed gently at his side, and suddenly he could sense something else, a wrongness in the air. A disturbance in the natural order that spoke of barriers being tested and boundaries being probed. Somewhere to the north, one of the ancient seals was under assault. "I must go," he said abruptly, startling the council members. "There are responsibilities that cannot wait." "Go where?" Jarl Eriksson demanded. "Bjarke, you're speaking in riddles, and that sword. Where did it come from? What is happening here?" But Bjarke was already moving, the blade's guidance pulling him toward the temple's northern exit. He could feel the other members of his bloodline scattered across the land, distant cousins who carried lesser responsibilities, keepers of individual seals and watchers of specific sites. They were calling to him through the network of power that connected all who bore this burden, warning him of encroaching darkness. "Watch over my holdings," he called back to the stunned council. "I will return when I can." As he reached the broken doorway, Magnus called after him, "Your grandmother would be proud, Bjarke Runolfsson." She knew this day would come. The words followed him as he began to run. The awakened blade, guiding his steps toward whatever crisis awaited in the northern wastes. The northern wastes stretched before Bjarke like a frozen sea of white and grey, broken only by the dark spears of pine trees and the jagged teeth of distant mountains. He had been traveling for 3 days now, following the blade's guidance through landscapes that grew more desolate with each mile. The sword pulled him forward with an urgency that allowed little rest, its inner light pulsing faster as they drew closer to whatever crisis awaited. On the second night, camped in the shelter of a wind-carved stone formation, he had encountered the first of his distant kinfolk. Astrid Thornsdottir appeared out of the blizzard like a wraith, her wolfskin cloak white with snow, and her eyes carrying the same weight of inherited responsibility that now marked his own gaze. "Cousin," she had said, though they had never met and the blood connection stretched back 7 generations. "You feel it too. The stirring in the deep places, the weakening of the bonds our ancestors forged." She was keeper of the Thorn Spire, a standing stone circle that maintained one of the northern seals. For 40 years, she had tended its ward fires and renewed its protective rituals, living in solitude, except for the mountain folk who brought her supplies and news from the world below. But 3 days ago, the stones had begun to crack, and shadows had started moving in the spaces between them, shadows that whispered of hunger and promised release from ancient prisons. "It's not just my circle," Astrid explained as they shared the warmth of his small fire. "I can feel the others through the blood link. Bjorn at Raven's Hollow, Leif at the Iron Gates, Sigrid who keeps the Sea Ward, all of them are struggling to hold their positions against something that grows, stronger each day. She pulled from her pack a shard of black stone that seemed to drink the firelight around it. This fell from the sky 3 nights past, not far from my circle. Where it struck the earth, the grass died, and the very stones began to whisper. I've seen such things in the old texts, fragments of the hungering dark, cast forth when the imprisoned powers test their bonds. Bjarke examined the shard with eyes that the blade's awakening had sharpened beyond normal human perception. Within its dark surface, he could see glimpses of vast spaces filled with entities that had no right to exist. Beings of pure appetite that viewed the world of men as nothing more than a larder waiting to be opened. "How long do we have?" he asked. Astrid's weathered face was grim. "The chronicle in my keeping speaks of convergences, times when the barriers between worlds grow thin and the sealed powers can reach through more easily. The next convergence comes with the winter solstice, barely a fortnight away. If they break free, then..." She didn't need to finish. Bjarke had read enough of his own chronicle to understand the consequences. The hungering dark would pour forth like a tide of living shadow, consuming everything in its path. The northern lands would fall first, their populations devoured or transformed into extensions of the alien will. Then the hunger would spread south, rolling across kingdoms and empires until nothing remained but an empty world, picked clean of life. Now, as he crested a ridge and saw the thornspire standing stones in the valley below, Bjarke understood why the blade had driven him here with such urgency. Half the ancient circle lay in ruins, the massive stones cracked and fallen like broken teeth. Dark mist seeped from the gaps between the remaining pillars, and in that mist, shapes moved with predatory grace. The void-touched helm lay at the circle's center, gleaming with malevolent purpose where it had fallen from some gap in reality. Unlike the blessed artifacts of his bloodline, this helm radiated wrongness, a crown forged in the spaces between stars for beings that should never have been given form. Whoever wore it would gain power beyond imagining. But at the cost of their humanity and their soul, Astrid knelt beside the largest of the fallen stones, her hands pressed against its fractured surface as she fought to channel what remained of the circle's protective power. Blood ran from her nose and ears, signs that she was pushing her abilities far beyond safe limits in a desperate attempt to hold the breach closed. "I can't maintain this much longer," she gasped as Bjarke approached. "The stones are failing, and that accursed helm is calling to something in the deep places. Every moment it remains here weakens the seal further." Bjarke drew the awakened blade, and its light caused the dark mist to recoil with sounds like breaking glass. But even as the immediate shadows retreated, he could see more pressing in from the edges of the circle, drawn by the helm's presence like moths to a flame. "We need to destroy it," he said, moving toward the artifact. "No!" Astrid's warning came sharp and urgent. "Touch that thing and it will corrupt you." The helm was forged to be indestructible by any earthly force. Only the powers that created it can unmake it. But her eyes fixed on the blade in his hand, and understanding passed between them. The Blade of Awakening was no earthly weapon. It had been forged in the spaces between worlds, tempered with forces that predated the creation of stars. If anything could destroy the helm, it would be this, but using the blade for such a purpose would have consequences. Bjarke could feel the knowledge flowing into his mind from the Chronicles. Teachings destroying an artifact of the hungering. Dark would create a backlash of released energy that could shatter the remaining seals across the northern lands. Every keeper, every guardian, every member of his bloodline who maintained the ancient barriers would feel the shock. Some might not survive it. "There has to be another way," he said, though even as he spoke, he could see the situation deteriorating. More stones were cracking, and the shapes in the mist were growing bolder, testing the boundaries of Astrid's weakening ward. "Look around you, cousin," Astrid replied with bitter honesty. "The other way is what we've been trying for 3 days. The helm grows stronger with each passing hour, and the convergence approaches whether we're ready or not. Sometimes the only choice is between terrible options and worse ones. The blade pulsed in Bjarke's grip, and he felt its eagerness to be used for its intended purpose. It had been forged for moments like this, times when the fate of the world balanced on the edge of a single decision. But the weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a mountain. How many of his distant kinfolk would die when the backlash struck? How many seals would fail in the aftermath? Behind them, something howled in the darkness beyond the circle, a sound that spoke of hunger older than human civilization and appetites that could never be satisfied. The void-touched helm pulsed with responding energy, and cracks began spreading through the last intact standing stones. Time was running out, and Bjarke realized that sometimes being the guardian meant making choices that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The howling from beyond the circle grew closer, and with it came a presence that made the very air feel thick and poisonous. Bjarke could sense it approaching through the network of shadows, something vast and hungry that had been testing the boundaries of its prison for centuries, waiting for this moment of weakness. "It's coming," Astrid whispered, her face pale with exhaustion. "The first hunger. I can feel its attention turning toward us, like the gaze of a dying star." Bjarke raised the blade, its light pushing back the encroaching darkness, but he knew they needed more than weapons to face what approached. In his heightened awareness, he could sense the other guardians across the northern lands, all struggling with similar breaches, all feeling the growing pressure as the convergence drew near. But there was something else, a memory stirring in the depths of his transformed consciousness, knowledge that came not from the Chronicle, but from deeper sources. His grandmother's voice whispered across the decades, sharing wisdom she had been forbidden to speak while she lived. The blade was never meant to fight alone. Her voice carried on the wind. There are words of binding, rituals of joining that can link the guardians across any distance. Your bloodline scattered for safety, but in times of greatest need, they can become one. The Soul Forge amulet materialized around his neck, not the simple silver pendant of his inheritance, but its true form revealed by necessity. The metal expanded and shifted, becoming an intricate network of channels and symbols that pulsed with the heartbeat of every guardian alive. Through it, he could feel his distant kinfolk as clearly as if they stood beside him, Bjorn at Raven's Hollow, fighting shadows that poured from a crack in the mountainside. Leif at the iron gates, holding back a tide of whispers that sought to drive men mad. Sigrid at the seaward, watching the very waters turn black with creeping corruption. A dozen others scattered across the frozen north, each standing alone against forces that no single person should have to face. "Join with me," Bjarke called out. Not with his voice, but through the bloodline connection that the amulet amplified. "Let us stand together as our ancestors did in the first days." The response came like a choir of distant voices, each guardian adding their will to his. The sensation was overwhelming. Suddenly he was not just Bjarke Runolfsson, but part of something larger, a collective consciousness that spanned the breadth of the northern lands. Their individual powers merged and amplified, creating something far greater than the sum of its parts. Through Bjorn's eyes, he saw the creatures pouring from the mountain crack, things that had once been men, but had been reshaped by exposure to the hungering dark, their forms twisted into tools of alien appetite. Through Sigrid's senses, he felt the corrupted waters lapping at the shores, each wave carrying whispers of madness and transformation, but he also felt their combined strength. The way their scattered lights joined together to form a barrier of will and purpose that the darkness could not easily break. This was how the first guardians had fought, not as isolated sentinels, but as a unified force, their individual sacrifices made meaningful by their connection to the greater whole. "Now," Astrid said, understanding flooding her voice as she felt the joining through her own bloodline connection. "While we are linked, while our power is focused, destroy the helm." Bjarke raised the awakened blade, but as he prepared to strike, the void-touched helm seemed to sense its danger. The artifact rose from the ground, hovering in the air as dark energy crackled around it. The shadows within the circle coalesced into a form that hurt to look upon, a figure that might once have been human, but had been hollowed out and filled with hungry darkness. You would preserve this dying world. The shadow figure spoke with a voice like breaking stone. You would keep your people locked in ignorance and struggle when they could know the freedom of dissolution, the peace of becoming part of something greater. I've seen your version of peace, Bjarke replied, the blade's light growing brighter as he channeled the combined will of his bloodline. It's the peace of the grave, the quiet of worlds picked clean of life. The shadow figure laughed, a sound like wind through empty skulls. And what is this existence you fight so hard to preserve? A few brief decades of pain and loss, of watching loved ones age and die, of struggling against forces beyond your understanding? We offer eternity, an end to suffering, to doubt, to the crushing weight of individual consciousness. Through the bloodline link, Bjarke felt his fellow guardians' memories, the losses they had endured, the loneliness of their calling, the constant burden of protecting a world that would never know or appreciate their sacrifice. For a moment, the shadow figure's words carried a terrible appeal, but then he felt something else through the connection. Astrid's determination as she thought of the mountain folk who brought her supplies, their simple kindness and genuine concern for her welfare. Bjorn's fierce joy as he remembered his daughter's laughter, even though she lived far from his post and rarely saw him. Sigrid's quiet satisfaction in watching ships return safely to harbor, their crews unaware that her vigilance had kept them safe from things that swam in deeper waters. You're right that existence brings pain, Bjarke said, stepping closer to the hovering helm. But it also brings beauty and love and the chance to make choices that matter. You offer eternity, but at the cost of everything that makes eternity worth having. The blade struck the void-touched helm with a sound like reality tearing. The artifact's surface cracked, and from the fissures poured light that was neither white nor any color that belonged to the physical world. The shadow figure shrieked and began to dissolve, its form unraveling as the helm that had anchored it to this realm was destroyed. But even as the immediate threat ended, Bjarke felt the backlash beginning. The helm's destruction sent shockwaves through the network of seals and barriers that protected the northern lands. Some of his fellow guardians cried out in pain as their own positions were shaken. Two of the more distant voices, keepers he had barely sensed through the link, fell silent altogether. The price had been paid, but the war was far from over. Through the bloodline connection, he could feel new breaches opening, other artifacts of the hungering dark making their presence known across the frozen wastes. The convergence was still days away, and already they had lost guardians to the growing chaos. We've bought time, Astrid said, wiping blood from her eyes as the immediate crisis passed. But look. She gestured toward the horizon, where the aurora borealis danced across the sky in patterns that spoke of barriers strained to their breaking point. The convergence was accelerating, drawn by the violence of the helm's destruction. The final battle comes sooner than we thought, Bjarke realized, and we're going to face it with fewer guardians than we started with. Through the Soulforge amulet, he felt his surviving kinfolk's grim determination. They would stand their posts, fight their individual battles, and hold the line as long as possible. But they all knew that the real test would come at the convergence itself. And that would require more than scattered guardians fighting alone. It would require a choice that no member of his bloodline had been forced to make for 1,000 years. The journey back to Nordhelm took Bjarke through landscapes transformed by the helm's destruction. Where the backlash had struck hardest, the very ground bore scars, patches of earth that had turned to glass, trees whose leaves had crystallized and fallen like bitter snow, streams that now ran backward or not at all. The world itself was struggling to maintain its coherence as the ancient seals weakened, but it was what he found waiting for him at his own hall that truly shattered his understanding of everything he thought he knew. Jarl Eriksson stood in the courtyard, but he was not alone. Beside him waited a figure that made Bjarke's blood run cold, tall and pale, with features that seemed carved from ice and eyes that held depths no human gaze should possess. The stranger wore robes that shifted color in the lamplight, and when he moved, the air around him rippled like water disturbed by an unseen current. "Bjarke Runolfsson," the figure said, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke of vast spaces and alien geometries. "I am Valdrik the Truth Seeker, and I have traveled far to speak with you." The awakened blade at Bjarke's side hummed with warning, its light flickering as it sensed something fundamentally wrong about their visitor. But before he could draw the weapon, Valdrik raised a hand that held an artifact Bjarke recognized from the oldest pages of the Chronicle, the Orb of Binding, a sphere of crystallized starlight that could compel truth from any living being. "Peace, Guardian," Valdrik said with a smile that never touched his eyes. "I come not as an enemy, but as one who would save your people from a tragedy born of ignorance." Jarl Eriksson stepped forward, his face bearing an expression of desperate hope mixed with terrible uncertainty. "Bjarke, this man, he knows things. About the disturbances in the north, about what you've been doing with that cursed blade. He says he can help us understand what's really happening, and what does he claim is really happening?" Bjarke asked, though he kept his hand near the sword's hilt. Valdrik's smile widened, and when he spoke, the Orb of Binding pulsed with light that made it impossible to disbelieve his words. "What's happening, dear Guardian, is that your bloodline has been deceived for 1,000 years. The entities you call the Hungering Dark are not invaders seeking to devour your world. They are prisoners, beings of pure knowledge and wisdom who were locked away by those who feared their gifts." The words hit Bjarke like physical blows, each one carrying the weight of absolute truth that the orb's power enforced. He found himself unable to reject them, even as every instinct screamed that they were wrong. "The first Guardians," Valdrik continued, his voice growing more persuasive with each word, "were not heroes protecting humanity. They were tyrants who chose ignorance over enlightenment, who decided that their people should remain trapped in brief, painful lives rather than ascending to something greater through the Soulforge amulet." Bjarke felt his fellow Guardians' confusion and growing doubt as Valdrik's words reached them through the bloodline connection. The orb's power was affecting all of them, making it impossible to resist the logic of what they were hearing. "Consider the evidence," Valdrik said, gesturing toward the scars that the backlash had left on the landscape. "Every time you use your weapons against the darkness, you cause suffering and destruction. Every seal you maintain keeps beings of infinite wisdom trapped in torment. You've been taught to see their attempts at communication as attacks, their offers of transcendence as threats of consumption." Bjarke struggled against the compulsion, but the orb's power was too strong. The truth it enforced was absolute, undeniable, overwhelming. He found himself remembering every moment of doubt he had felt, every question about whether the burden he carried was truly necessary. "Your grandmother knew," Valdrik said softly. "In her final years, she began to understand the truth. Why do you think she never told you directly about your inheritance? Why did she leave you to discover it through dreams and visions rather than clear instruction?" The words cut deep because they resonated with questions Bjarke had already been asking himself. If the responsibility was so important, why had Solveig been so cryptic about it? Why leave him to stumble into understanding rather than preparing him properly? "She was beginning to question the old ways," Valdrik explained, his voice gentle with false compassion. "But she died before she could complete her investigation, before she could learn the full truth about what your bloodline has done." The Jarl stepped closer, his weathered face creased with concern. "Bjarke, if this is true, if we've been causing harm rather than preventing it, surely we must stop. Surely we must find a way to make amends." Through the bloodline link, Bjarke felt similar conversations taking place at every Guardian post across the northern lands. Valdrik's influence was spreading, his truth-compelling artifact turning their greatest strength, their connection to each other, into a weapon against them. One by one, his fellow Guardians were laying down their weapons, abandoning their posts, choosing to believe that their long vigil had been a tragic mistake. But even as the orb's power pressed against his mind, Bjarke felt something else, a memory not his own, bleeding through from the depths of the Soulforge amulet. His grandmother's voice, but not as he had known it. This was Solveig as a young woman, strong and certain, speaking words that had been locked away until this moment of greatest need. If you are hearing this, grandson, then the truth seeker has come at last, and the final deception is at hand. The orb he carries is itself a thing of the hungering dark, forged to turn truth into lie and certainty into doubt. What he speaks feels true because he has the power to make it so. But beneath the compulsion lies the same hunger that has always sought to break free. The memory continued, showing him visions of the early days, not the sanitized version Valdric presented, but the full horror of what had actually happened. He saw cities consumed not by noble beings of wisdom, but by entities of pure appetite that left nothing behind but empty husks. He watched as entire populations chose transcendence and found only annihilation. Their consciousness dissolved into something vast and hungry that cared nothing for individual existence. The Guardians were not tyrants, Solveig's voice whispered across the centuries. They were survivors, the only ones who resisted the call to transcendence long enough to see what it truly meant. They forged the seals, not to imprison wisdom but to cage hunger, not to deny enlightenment, but to preserve the possibility of choice. The true nature of the orb of binding became clear to him then. It did not compel truth, it overwrote reality, making its holder's words become truth through the sheer force of alien will. Valdric was not revealing hidden knowledge, but creating new facts, rewriting the history of the world to serve the purposes of the entities he served. "You feel the doubt," Valdric said, noticing Bjarke's struggle. "Good. Doubt is the beginning of wisdom. Release your blade, Guardian. Let the seals fall. Allow your people to choose their own destiny rather than having it decided for them by ancient fears." But Bjarke was remembering more now. Memories from the blade itself, forged as it was from materials that existed before the current reality began. He saw the truth of what transcendence meant, not elevation but absorption, not wisdom but the extinction of everything that made consciousness worth preserving. The entities of the hungering dark did not consume flesh. They consumed meaning itself, taking the rich complexity of individual existence and reducing it to simple appetite. They offered eternity, but it was the eternity of the grave, dressed up in promises of enlightenment and release from suffering. "No," Bjarke said, his voice cutting through the orb's compulsion like the blade's light cut through shadow. "I have seen the truth behind your truth, and I choose the burden my ancestors chose." He drew the awakened blade, and its light revealed Valdric for what he truly was, not a seeker of truth, but a herald of ending, a thing wearing human form to spread the very corruption he claimed to oppose. The final battle was no longer days away. It was beginning here, now in this moment of choice between preservation and dissolution, between the pain of existence and the peace of oblivion. And Bjarke realized that everything that had come before had been preparation for this single, crucial decision. The moment Bjarke's blade touched the air, Valdric's human facade began to crack like ice under spring sun. The pale features shifted and warped, revealing glimpses of something vast and alien beneath the borrowed flesh. But the truth-seeker did not retreat. Instead, he raised the orb of binding higher, its light growing so bright that it turned the evening air white as noon. "You would choose suffering over peace." Valdric's voice now carried harmonics that made the very stones of the courtyard tremble. "We would condemn your people to brief, painful lives when they could know eternal transcendence." The orb's power pressed against Bjarke's mind like a tide of molten lead, trying to rewrite his understanding of reality itself. Around him, he felt his fellow guardians through the Soulforge amulet. Some had already succumbed to the false truth, laying down their weapons and opening the seals they had spent their lives protecting. Others struggled as he did, torn between instinct and compulsion. But there were still those who held firm, and through them, Bjarke began to understand the true scope of what they faced. This was not just Valdric, Across the northern lands, other truth-seekers had appeared, each carrying artifacts of deception, each working to turn the Guardians against their own purpose. The convergence had not merely been accelerated, it had been orchestrated. "Astrid!" he called through the bloodline link, his mental voice cutting through the static of alien influence. "Can you hear me?" Her response came weak but determined. "I'm here, cousin. Barely. There's one of them at my position too, claims to be my grandmother's spirit. Tells me the stones I've guarded are prisons for the innocent." "It's a lie," Bjarke projected, pouring all his certainty into the words. "Remember the helm? Remember what we saw in its depths?" That's what they really are. Through the network, he felt other Guardians beginning to break free from the compulsion, their own memories of corruption and hunger helping them resist the false truths being forced upon them. But for every mind that cleared, another fell to the truth-seeker's influence. The bloodline was dividing against itself, exactly as their enemies had planned. Jarl Eriksson stepped between Bjarke and Valdrik, his hand on his sword hilt, but uncertainty written across his weathered features. "Bjarke, I've known you since you were a boy. If there's even a chance that what this man says is true—" "Look at him," Bjarke said, pointing the awakened blade toward Valdrik. In its light, the truth-seeker's true nature was becoming increasingly visible, something that had never been human, wearing flesh like an ill-fitting garment. "Does that look like a seeker of truth to you?" But even as he spoke, Bjarke felt the weight of impossible choice settling upon him like a mountain. The heart of convergence had begun to manifest, not a physical artifact, but a nexus of power that existed in the spaces between realities. Through the Soul Forge amulet, he could sense its growing presence like a wound in the world itself, a point where the barriers between dimensions grew thin enough for the hungering dark to reach through. The convergence was not simply an astronomical event, but a deliberate weakening of reality's foundations, engineered over centuries by the imprisoned entities. Every broken seal, every corrupted guardian, every moment of doubt and despair had contributed to this moment when the walls between worlds would become permeable enough for invasion. "You feel it, don't you?" Valdrik said, his borrowed features now shifting constantly as the human mask became harder to maintain. "The heart of convergence awakening. Even now, your fellow Guardians abandon their posts, choosing wisdom over ignorance. Soon, the barriers will fall entirely, and your people will be free to choose their own destiny." Through the bloodline link, Bjarke felt the truth of those words. Guardian after Guardian was laying down their weapons, overwhelmed by the truth-seekers' compulsions, or simply exhausted by the weight of their burdens. The seals were failing faster now, not through assault but through abandonment. But he also felt something else, the remaining Guardians drawing closer together, their individual lights merging into something that might be strong enough to stand against the coming darkness. They were converging too, not on a place but on a purpose, guided by the same instincts that had brought their bloodline together in the first hours of crisis 1,000 years ago. "The blade knows," whispered his grandmother's voice through the depths of memory. "It remembers the first convergence, when the Guardians discovered that scattered defense was not enough. Sometimes the only way to preserve everything is to risk everything." The knowledge flowed into him, like ice water in his veins. There was a way to stop the convergence, to seal the hungering dark away permanently, rather than simply delaying their eventual escape. But it would require all the remaining Guardians to gather in one place, to merge their individual powers into something greater than the sum of its parts. It would also require them to sacrifice the very network that connected them, burning out the Soul Forge amulets in a conflagration of protective power that would either save the world or destroy everyone who attempted it. "Astrid," he called through the link. "Bjorn, Leif, Sigrid, all of you who can still hear me. The Temple of Adravola. We make our stand there, together." The responses came immediately, some voices strong with determination, others weak with exhaustion, but all carrying the same desperate resolve. They would come, those who could break free from their positions, those who had not already fallen to the truth-seekers' influence. But even as he felt their agreement, Bjarke realized how few they were. Of the dozens of guardians who had begun this crisis, barely a handful remained true to their purpose. The rest had either been killed in the backlash from the Helm's destruction or turned by the false truths being spread across the northern lands. "You would gather the last of your bloodline for slaughter?" Baldric's voice carried mocking amusement. "How fitting that the tyrants who began this tragedy should end it through their own destruction." "Not destruction," Bjarke replied, backing toward the courtyard's gate while keeping the blade between himself and the truth-seeker. "Transformation. The same choice our ancestors made when they first chose to stand guard." He reached the gate and turned to run, feeling Baldric's alien laughter following him into the night. Behind him, the orb of binding flared with renewed power, and he knew that by morning Nordhelm would be firmly under the truth-seeker's influence. His old life was ending, but perhaps that was as it should be. The race to Adravolla took him through landscapes that grew more surreal with each mile. The convergence was affecting reality itself, creating pockets where the laws of physics bent or broke entirely. He passed a grove where the trees grew downward into the sky, their roots seeking stars instead of soil. He crossed a stream that flowed uphill, its waters carrying whispers in languages that predated human speech. Other guardians joined him along the way, Astrid appearing out of a blizzard that existed only around her, her wolfskin cloak now bearing frost patterns that moved like living things. Bjorn emerged from a mountain path that led through solid stone, his massive frame radiating heat that melted snow for yards around him. One by one they gathered, the last remnants of a bloodline that had guarded the world for 1,000 years. But even as they approached the ancient temple, Bjarke could feel the heart of convergence growing stronger, its presence turning the very air thick and oily. Through the failing seals came whispers of promise and threat, offers of transcendence mixed with declarations of hunger. The hungering dark knew they were coming. More than that, it was waiting for them, confident that even this final gathering of guardians would be insufficient to stop what had been set in motion across the centuries. As they reached the ruins of Adravolla, now glowing with unearthly light that seeped from the hidden chamber below, Bjarke realized that their enemies might be right. They were so few, so tired, carrying artifacts of power that might not be enough to seal away entities that had grown stronger during their long imprisonment. But they were here, and they would make the attempt, because some choices had to be made regardless of their chances of success. Through the Soul Forge amulet, he felt his fellow guardians' grim determination, their willingness to burn themselves out entirely if it meant preserving the world they had sworn to protect. The final battle would begin at dawn, when the convergence reached its peak and the barriers between worlds grew thin enough for the true assault to begin. Until then, they would prepare themselves for a choice that would echo across eternity, whether to preserve the painful beauty of mortal existence or surrender it to the peaceful oblivion of transcendence. In the distance, aurora lights danced across the sky in patterns that hurt to watch directly, and Bjarke knew that whatever happened in the coming hours would reshape the world forever. Dawn came not with the warm gold of sunrise, but with a light that seemed to bleed through the fabric of reality itself. The aurora that had danced across the northern sky all night now formed a spiral directly above the temple of Adravolla, its colors shifting through spectrums that had no names in human language. 7 guardians stood in the broken chamber where Bjarke had first claimed the awakened blade. 7 out of the dozens who had begun this crisis. Astrid pressed her hand against a crack in the wall where something that might have been starlight leaked through. Bjorn knelt beside the altar, his massive hands gentle as he arranged the artifacts they had brought, fragments of standing stones, vials of water from sacred springs, pieces of metal that had been touched by the first forge fires. "The convergence reaches its peak in moments," Sigrid said, her voice carrying the authority of one who had spent decades reading the patterns of tide and star. "I can feel the barriers dissolving like ice in a furnace. through the circular opening in the floor. Sounds rose from the depths that no human throat could make. Not quite music, not quite language, but something that bypassed the ears entirely and spoke directly to the deepest parts of the mind. The hungering dark was calling to them, offering one final chance to choose transcendence over struggle. Bjarke felt the Soul Forge amulet growing warm against his chest as the network of guardians prepared for their ultimate joining. But this would be different from their earlier connections. This would burn out the artifacts entirely, consuming the accumulated power of 1,000 years in a single, desperate gambit. "Are we certain this is the only way?" asked Leif, though his hand remained steady on the hilt of his inherited blade. "Once we begin, there can be no retreat, no second chances." "Look around you," Astrid replied, gesturing toward the cracks spreading through the chamber walls. "Reality itself is failing. The convergence has progressed too far for half measures." She was right. Even as they spoke, the solid stone of the ancient temple was becoming translucent, revealing glimpses of vast spaces that existed somewhere else, someone else. In those alien dimensions, shapes moved with predatory grace, the true forms of the entities that had been testing their bonds for centuries. The heart of convergence manifested fully in that moment, appearing in the center of their circle as a sphere of crystallized nothingness that hurt to perceive directly. It was not darkness, but the absence of light, not emptiness, but the negation of substance itself. Looking at it, Bjarke understood why his ancestors had been willing to sacrifice so much to keep it sealed away. Through the heart, the voices of the hungering dark grew clearer, more persuasive. They spoke of the pain his small band had endured, the loneliness of their vigil, the weight of responsibility that had shaped their entire lives, the knowledge that they would die unsung and unremembered by the people they protected. "Release your burdens," the voices whispered with honeyed poison. "Join with us and know peace beyond imagining. Your individual suffering will dissolve into our eternal understanding. Your mortal concerns will be transformed into cosmic perspective." For a moment, Bjarke wavered. The offer was so tempting, especially when weighed against the agony he could feel building in the Soul Forge amulet as it prepared to channel more power than any single artifact was meant to contain. They were going to burn themselves out, not just the artifacts, but possibly their very souls, in an attempt that might fail regardless. But then he felt the weight of the awakened blade in his hand, remembered the guardian spirits who had watched over it for centuries, thought of his grandmother's voice guiding him across the decades toward this moment of choice. "We are the guardians," he said, his voice cutting through the alien whispers. "We stand between the world and the dark, not because it is easy, but because it is necessary." He raised the blade, and its light pushed back against the heart of convergence, causing the sphere of nothingness to ripple like disturbed water. Around him, his fellow guardians drew their own weapons, blades and staves and artifacts of binding that had been passed down through generations of sacrifice. "Together," Astrid said, placing her hand on the Soul Forge amulet at Bjarke's throat. One by one, the others followed suit, their individual powers flowing into the network that connected them all. The sensation was beyond description. 7 minds becoming one, 7 wills merging into a single purpose that transcended individual existence, while preserving what made each guardian unique. Through their joined consciousness, Bjarke felt the true scope of what they faced. The hungering dark was not merely alien, it was antithetical to existence itself. A force that sought not conquest, but consumption, not transformation, but annihilation. It had been patient because patience cost it nothing, testing the barriers because testing required no effort. But now that the convergence had weakened reality's foundations, it was ready to pour through and reduce everything to the peaceful emptiness it preferred. "Now," he whispered, and felt his fellow guardian's agreement like an echo in his bones. The Soul Forge amulet began to burn. The Soul Forge amulet exploded into incandescent fire that transcended mere heat and light, becoming something that existed in dimensions beyond the physical. Through the network of burning metal, the Guardians' individual essences, merged and amplified until they were no longer 7 people wielding separate powers, but a single force of protective will that had been building momentum for 1,000 years. Bjarke felt himself expanding beyond the boundaries of flesh and bone, his consciousness touching every sealed chamber, every warded stone, every hidden barrier that his bloodline had maintained across the northern lands. He was the network itself now, feeling the weight of every choice his ancestors had made, understanding at last why the burden had been too great for any one person to carry. The heart of convergence pulsed with malevolent response, and through it came the true assault, not armies of shadow or hosts of corrupted spirits, but the hungering dark itself, pouring through the dimensional breach like a tide of living void. It touched the edges of their merged consciousness and began to feed, trying to consume their very essence as it had consumed so many others across the eons. But this time it encountered resistance that surprised it. The Guardians were not fighting to preserve themselves, but to preserve something greater, the right of individual consciousness to exist. The beauty of imperfect mortal lives, the possibility that meaning could be created rather than simply consumed. Their sacrifice was not born of despair, but of love so profound it transformed their burning essences into something the hungering dark could not digest. Through the network, Bjarke felt his fellow Guardians giving everything they were and had ever been to the conflagration of protective power. Astrid's fierce independence earned through decades of solitary vigilance, Bjorn's unshakable loyalty to family and land, Sigrid's deep understanding of the rhythms that connected all living things. Each Guardian's essence became fuel for a barrier not of stone or metal, but of pure purpose. The awakened blade in his hand was no longer separate from him, but part of his very being. Its 1,000-year accumulation of protective power, adding to the torrent of force that now stood between the world and annihilation. Through it, he could feel the other artifacts of his bloodline, every sword and amulet and standing stone that had ever been touched by Guardian hands. All of them awakening simultaneously across the northern lands. The hungering dark recoiled from their combined assault, its vast intelligence finally recognizing that it faced something it had not encountered before, beings willing to sacrifice not just their lives, but their very existence for principles larger than themselves. It had consumed civilizations, devoured gods, reduced entire realities to empty void. But it had never faced love so absolute that it became a weapon. But even as they pushed back against the cosmic hunger, Bjarke felt the cost mounting. The Guardians were burning out like candles in a hurricane, their individual personalities beginning to dissolve under the strain of channeling so much power. Soon, there would be nothing left of them but the echo of their sacrifice. Yet in that moment of dissolution, he glimpsed something that made the price seem worthwhile. The barriers they were creating would not merely contain the hungering dark, they would transform it, forcing the alien entities to experience existence as individual consciousness rather than collective void. It would be a kind of hell for beings that preferred emptiness, but it would also be a chance for them to understand what they had been trying to destroy. Now, he cried with a voice that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously. Seal it forever! The Soulforge amulet shattered, releasing the accumulated power of every Guardian who had ever lived in a single, reality-reshaping pulse. The heart of convergence cracked like an egg, its crystallized nothingness replaced by something that sparkled with the light of newborn stars. The dimensional breach began to close, not with the finality of a slamming door, but with the gentle certainty of a wound healing. Through the network that was dissolving even as it achieved its purpose, Bjarke felt the seals across the northern lands transforming from barriers into something else. Gardens, perhaps, where the entities of the hungering dark would learn to exist as individuals, to experience the joy and pain and wonder of limited consciousness until they understood why such things were worth preserving. The ancient temple of Edravola began to change around them. its broken stones flowing like water as they reformed into something that was part sanctuary, part monument, part living testament to the choice that had been made. The chamber where they stood became a hall of memory, where the names and faces of every guardian would be preserved for as long as the world endured. As his consciousness finally began to fade, Bjarke felt a profound sense of completion. The burden had been lifted not through abandonment, but through fulfillment. The compact had been kept not through endless vigilance, but through willing transformation. The last thing he saw before the light claimed him was his grandmother's face, young and proud, welcoming him home to a rest that had been earned through choices made with full understanding of their cost. The convergence was ending, not in conquest or defeat, but in something entirely new. A world where the Guardian's sacrifice had become the foundation for a different kind of existence, one where even hunger could learn to love. 3 months after the convergence, Jarl Eriksson stood at the edge of what had once been the ruins of Idravalla and marveled at the transformation. Where broken stones had lain scattered among weeds, a garden now flourished. Not of earthly plants, but of crystalline formations that sang softly in the wind and gave off light that warmed without burning. At the center of this impossible grove stood a structure that seemed to shift between temple and tree, its walls flowing like living stone, its branches reaching toward sky and stars with equal grace. The Jarl was not alone in his pilgrimage. Every day, people came from across the northern lands to see the place where the world had been saved by sacrifice, where the burden of guardianship had finally been transformed into something beautiful. They brought offerings, not to gods or spirits, but to the memory of those who had chosen love over survival, protection over preservation. You feel it too, don't you? Old Magnus approached with steps that seemed steadier than they had in years. The change in the air, the lightness where there used to be weight. Eriksson nodded, his weathered face reflecting wonder that would have seemed impossible 3 months ago. The dreams have stopped, not just mine, everyone's. The nightmares that have plagued the northern lands for generations, the sense that something vast and hungry was watching from the darkness, all of it gone. They walked together toward the memorial hall that had grown from the temple's heart. Inside, the walls bore images that moved like living memory, scenes of guardians across the centuries, each one captured in moments of choice and sacrifice. Bjarke's grandmother Solveig was there, young and fierce, as she sealed away the first stirrings of the hungering dark. His grandfather, whose name had been lost to time, but whose deed of protecting a village from shadow-touched wolves was preserved in flowing light. And there, at the center of it all, Bjarke himself, not as the wealthy merchant he had been, but as the guardian he had become. The image showed him in the moment of decision, his hand on the awakened blade, his eyes reflecting the weight of understanding. Around him stood his fellow guardians, their faces serene with the knowledge that their choice would echo across eternity. "Do you think they knew?" Magnus asked quietly. "When they made their choice, do you think they understood what would happen?" Before Eriksson could answer, a voice spoke from behind them, familiar but changed, carrying harmonics that spoke of existence beyond the merely human. "We knew enough," Bjarke said. They turned to see him standing in the doorway, not quite solid, not quite spirit, but something that partook of both natures. His form flickered between the successful merchant they had known and the cosmic guardian he had become, settling finally into something that was recognizably himself, but touched by infinite perspective. "Bjarke." Eriksson's voice carried disbelief mixed with hope. "But we thought you were dead?" "Dissolved. Consumed by powers beyond mortal comprehension." Bjarke's smile held warmth that transcended his translucent form. "All of those things, in a way, but also transformed, like everything else touched by the convergence." He gestured toward the walls, where new images were forming, scenes of former entities of the hungering dark, learning to exist as individuals, experiencing their first moments of genuine emotion, their first understanding of what it meant to love something beyond themselves. "The sacrifice didn't destroy them," he explained. "It taught them. force them to experience existence from the inside, rather than simply consuming it from without. They're learning what it means to be finite, to face loss, to find meaning in limitation. Magnus leaned heavily on his walking stick, his ancient eyes bright with understanding. "And you? What did you learn?" Bjarke's form solidified slightly, becoming more present, more real, that the burden was never meant to be carried forever. That guardianship is not about eternal vigilance, but about preparing the way for something better. We were never meant to hold back the darkness indefinitely. We were meant to transform it into light. Through the memorial hall's windows came the sound of laughter, children playing in the crystal gardens, their joy unmarked by the ancient fears that had haunted their parents' generation. The young ones born after the convergence seemed different somehow, more open to wonder, less burdened by the weight of inherited trauma. "What happens now?" Eriksson asked. "Without guardians, without the network of seals and barriers, now," Bjarke said, his voice carrying the authority of one who had seen beyond the boundaries of mortality, "the world learns to guard itself. Not through sacrifice and vigilance, but through understanding and choice. The entities that once threatened existence are becoming part of it, learning to create rather than consume. And humanity is finally free to grow into something greater without losing what makes them human." He moved toward the memorial's center, where a new artifact had appeared. Not a weapon or a tool of binding, but something that looked like a seed made of crystallized light. "This is what we bought with our sacrifice. Not just safety, but possibility. The chance for all consciousness, human, alien, and everything in between, to find new ways of existing together." As he spoke, the seed pulsed with gentle warmth, and Eriksson understood that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The age of guardians was over, but the age of gardeners had begun. Those who would tend the growth of new forms of existence, who would help both human and former entity learn to flourish in ways neither had imagined possible. "Will we see you again?" Magnus asked as Bjarke's form began to fade. "Always," came the reply, now carried on the wind itself. "We are part of the world now, woven into its very foundation. Whenever someone chooses love over fear, protection over preservation, transformation over destruction, we are there." The memorial hall grew quiet, except for the distant sound of children's laughter and the gentle song of the crystal gardens. Eriksson and Magnus stood in comfortable silence, understanding that they had witnessed not just the end of an age, but the beginning of something unprecedented. A world where even hunger could learn to nurture, where even darkness could choose to become light. Outside, the aurora danced in patterns of celebration rather than warning, painting the sky with colors that spoke of hope fulfilled and burdens transformed into blessings. The convergence was complete, and the world was finally truly free.